Okay. Trusty clicker. So, today we're going to talk about General Richard Montgomery, who was the namesake of Fort Montgomery. He becomes the first military hero of the American Revolution, and though he's relatively unknown today, during the first 100 years after his death, he was lauded with monuments. His name was given to towns and counties across the country. But who was he? That's what we're going to get into today. Richard Montgomery was born in Ireland, Dublin right here, and he was born north of Dublin, near Swords, December 2nd, 1738. He is the third of 4 children. He has 2 older brothers and 1 younger sister. He is the son of a former British military officer and member of the Irish Parliament, and as the son of landed gentry, he grows up receiving a classical education, which includes learning French, Latin, mathematics, natural sciences. His non-school pursuits include riding, hunting, and fishing. And so he's turning into quite an intelligent, well-rounded, robust, athletic young man. And this is going to mean a lot as time goes on, as you will see. In 1754, he concludes his studies in regular school, and he, at 16 years old, attends 2 years of higher learning at Trinity College in Dublin. Then, when he's 18, he does not graduate from college, but when he's 18, Richard's father purchases for him an army commission, that of an ensign of the 17th Regiment of Foot. This is the banner of the 17th Regiment of Foot under which he marched. And this is standard regalia for a British officer. You have the sword, you have the tricorner hat, and you have also a gorget, if you know what a gorget is. It's simply, in earlier times it actually protected the neck. But over time it became a sign of an officer. And when you're, especially in the late 1700s, and when you're in the middle of a battle, and they did not have smokeless powder, the battlefield is absolute chaos, and there's smoke and everything going everywhere. Very difficult to tell, because they're all wearing red coats, who is an officer and able to give orders and who is not. And so this was one of the things that they wore, so that you immediately knew who an officer was, and you'd be able to give who was actually giving the orders on the battlefield. So after 6 months of initial military training, Montgomery is shipped to America for his first taste of conflict and combat. He ends up going into what is then referred to as the 7 Years' War. In America, it was known as the French and Indian War, but because Richard Montgomery traveled far outside of the limits of what would be called the French and Indian War, that's why we concentrated on being the 7 Years' War. It's the first really global conflict fought on 5 continents and 3 oceans, and some historians argue that this war is the real World War I, and we'll see why in a minute. In America, it's referred to as the French and Indian War. So this is the area in America of the basic French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War encompasses really the entire world, and we'll see that more in a minute. So when Richard Montgomery's first taste of battle is up here at Louisburg. It's a French-held fort, and his regiment, along with many others, lays siege to the fort, takes it, and then from there he's moved down to Boston, for which he marches all the way over to Albany, and then up into this area, comes back down to Philadelphia, comes back up here, marching all over the place. So that's his initial involvement in the 7 Years' War, is in the French and Indian War in America. The 7 Years' War is actually a truly global in scale. This is where he's operating initially, right up in this area up here. But the war is throughout Europe. It's this whole area here. Anything that's in pink is where the war went. So it was really all over the world. And the reason why we bring the 7 Years' War into it is because he did not stay up in this area. He ended up down here in the Caribbean. So the campaigns that he takes part in are Louisburg, as we said, all the way up in Cape Breton Island near Nova Scotia, Canada. His performance is such that he is meritoriously promoted to lieutenant in 1758. They move down to Boston. They march from Boston to Lake George via Albany, and then march back down to Philadelphia to winter in 1759. They marched back up to Lake Champlain and began taking French forts all the way up. Let me go back here. French forts, Fort Carillon, Fort St. Frederick. There's a couple more forts up here before they get to Montreal. Oops. And they capture Montreal in 1760. At that point, because Quebec has already been taken by another force of British, they don't need to go any farther than Montreal. They move down and garrison in the Mohawk Valley. And from there, they move to New York City to prepare for the Caribbean campaign in 1761. They're shipped to Barbados, where they prepare for and take part in the capture of Martinique and the French West Indies. He does such a good job there that he's promoted to captain in early 1762. From there, they're shipped to Cuba. This guy is becoming quite the world traveler here. They're shipped to Cuba to take part in the siege and heavy fighting, and it was very heavy fighting, to capture Havana, late 1762. So, we'll stop here, pause right here for a moment. One of the things that happened during the siege of Cuba was that the British sent something around 8,000 to 9,000 soldiers down to take part in the siege and the capture of Cuba. Almost half of those soldiers were either completely incapacitated or died because they were not acclimated to the heat and the tropical diseases. Again, this is where the robustness of Captain Montgomery comes in, because while he had fallen ill to the same things that they did, it was not nearly, he did not nearly feel it as severely as the rest of them. And so he survived to become a captain, and he came back up into New York for 21 months of recuperation and garrison duty in New York State. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ends the 7 Years' War. The British had captured Havana, Cuba, and they had taken Cuba from the Spanish. The Spanish, it was given back to them, but the Spanish had to give up Florida to the British in order for that to happen. So after 21 months of recuperation and garrison duty, he marches out to Detroit to assist in diffusing the Pontiac's War, which is another Indian conflict. Part of putting this together is you have to winnow things out and narrow things down a little bit. So there's a whole lot going on here within this 21 months, but I'll just mention a couple of things. One is that probably after 12, 14 months of recuperation and garrison, he starts going up to to assist in Pontiac's War, is when he meets his future wife. And we'll refer to that farther on down the road. But it's in that time period right in here that he meets his future wife, and he will not marry her for probably another almost 9 or 10 years. He marches out to assist in diffusing. He actually doesn't really do any fighting in Pontiac's War. He becomes more of an administrator and diplomat until Pontiac's War is concluded, and then he leaves comes back into garrison into the Mohawk Valley area for personal reasons, requests leaves back to England, and finally gets ready to leave for England late 1764. He spends most of the next nearly 8 years traveling all over England as a captain. His duties include recruiting, training, administrative functions. During this time, his political views mature, and he begins to view the cabinet system of British government as corrupt and self-serving. One of the things that he does in this 8 years, in between times that he's moved to this place to do some recruiting, that place to do some administration, is he's talking with many of what were considered radical conservatives of the day around the London area. And so the more he talks with them, the more he feels personally that the British cabinet system as it exists and as it continues to grow is a very corrupt system, and he wants less and less of it. And this will, over time, as he gets to America, change how he views the British and how he changes in America to become actually a foe of the very system that he served for so many years. Possibly because of his political views. Now remember, he's nearly 8 years, he's been a captain this whole 8 years. His attempt to purchase a peacetime major's commission, going from captain to major, fails, and he decides to retire from the army, become a gentleman farmer in America. I don't know if you know that while he received battlefield commissions for lieutenant and captain, Once it became peacetime, the only way that you were able to advance in rank was to buy your next rank in the British Army. And so he tried, and he tried, and he tried, and whenever a major slot would open up, he would put his name in for it, and he would get rejected, and someone else would get it. At that time, a major's commission was approximately £1,500, and in today's money, it'd be somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. And so he had that money, and he just couldn't buy his way any higher in the British Army. And so he figured, well, going nowhere, this is a dead end. Let me do something else in life. He cuts that part of his life off and moves on. So with part of an inheritance, with the $1,500 that he was going to become a major with $1,500 in savings that he had somewhere else, he's a fairly wealthy man at this point. At 33 years old, he returns to New York City in late 1772 to begin the gentleman farmer chapter of his life. Every now and then, my clicker doesn't work. And it goes, there we go. So, during his time in New York, again, he was networking, and he made many, many contacts. When you're a British officer, it opens many doors. Back in the 1760s, 1770s, it opened many doors socially and professionally. And so he's got all these contacts that he made in New York City. So now when he goes back to New York City, through those contacts that he made, he finds a farm that's just off the north end of Manhattan up here in Kingsbridge. And he buys it in very, very early 1763. He repairs what needs fixing and begins raising cattle and tending the orchards that are on the land. About this same time, he renews his acquaintance with the woman that he had met 9 years earlier, Janet Livingston, of the very wealthy Livingston family. They own over 160,000 acres of land from just north of Spuyten Duyvil, right up here, all the way north to just south of Albany. Covers a huge amount of space. There's a portrait of Janet Livingston and her childhood home, Claremont, which you can still visit today. So, Janet is now 29 years old, and it's not that she has not had suitors. She's had many, many suitors, but they've all been New York rubes. So now Richard comes along again, and he is a 34-year-old. He is a landowner. He's relatively wealthy on his own. He's a world traveler. He's erudite. He's cultured. He's educated. Oh, boy, is he a catch. And so the family does only about a month of investigating of him, and they are ecstatic over his history. They can't wait for them to get married. So sure enough, Richard and Janet are married July 24th, 1773. And they move into a cottage on property owned by Janet. You can also visit this house today in Rhinebeck, New York. That's a picture I took, by the way, when I went up to visit. So yes, this is on 77 Livingston Street, right in the middle of Rhinebeck, New York. You can go up and see that house today.
Is it a museum?
No, it's actually used as a meeting house for the DAR.
Oh.
You can go up and see it. There was no one there. There was nothing in the way of tours or anything like that. But if someone is there, certainly, I'm sure if someone is there in the building, you knock on the door and you'd probably be able to get a tour through. I'm sure there isn't much there because it's used more as a meeting house than it is as an actual home. But the building is still there. This is not its original location. If you go up to Rhinebeck, on the north end of Rhinebeck, there's a massive hospital complex. And I believe that this house was on that property. And so when they were going to build all the grounds and the hospital, so on and so forth, they didn't want this house destroyed. So they found a lot in the middle of Rhinebeck, and they moved this house from there to this little lot. And it's been there for many, many years. And it's in great shape. And by all means, stop up and see it. So, when they're married, Janet is given an 818-acre parcel of land just south of Rhinebeck by her grandfather Beekman. So now the Livingstons are almost at the very top of the social scale. Just above them, the very, very top, is the Beekmans. And the Livingstons have married into the Beekmans. So grandfather Beekman gives Janet 818 acres of Beekman land just south of Rhinebeck. So if you go up today, This line right here is Route 9, goes up past the Dutch Australian grounds, goes up through Rhinebeck, so on and so forth. All of this area here was that 1,800 acre patent, and it's now partially farmland, partially wooded. It's still there. You go up and check it out if you want. There are 3 gates into the property, all of which are chained off and closed, but that is still there. So you can go up and see that if you like. So once she receives that, they're still living here in the middle of Rhinebeck. Richard starts to add to and farm and build their eventual home. He begins to build a 1-story federal-style house, and he's now in constant contact with many of the influential men in Dutchess County. So between their marriage in 1773 and his going to the provincial congress in 1775, he's got about 2 years now where he's networking in this area as part of the Livingstons, with all of the powerful people in the area. He's getting to meet, greet, see them, parties, financial transactions, so on and so forth. So he's becoming a very well-known, very well-respected member of the Dutchess County area. And so his house is completed about 2/3 of the way when he is elected to serve in the New York Provincial Congress in New York City, May 1775. They needed 10 delegates out of Dutchess County, and he was elected as one of the 10 delegates to go down to New York City. So Montgomery involves himself in many committees of the Provincial Congress, and his competence is quickly noted and appreciated, such that the Continental Congress in Philadelphia is made aware of him and his resume. And on June 15th, he's appointed to be a brigadier general under only Major General Schuyler, who is the commander of all New York State military forces, and General Washington. So in New York State, he becomes instantly the 3rd highest military man in an afternoon. On July 1st, he and Schuyler begin planning and preparing supplies and men for the invasion of Canada. So back in the French and Indian War, it became very clear to local colonists, to New Yorkers, so on and so forth, that the Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River corridor was an absolute avenue for invasion at any time. It's so easy to move men on boats down there versus marching all around it. And so with the coming revolution that the Continental Congress is seeing, they want to close off this avenue of invasion because it'll actually cut the colonies in half. And so they want to stop that. They see years before it happens exactly what the British are going to do. And so they task General Schuyler and General Montgomery with literally kicking the British out of Canada. Going up, invading Canada, take the whole area, get the British out so we don't have to face this corridor of invasion down through the lakes. So that's what he starts planning on July 1st. Oh, please. Oh, dear.
Wow. Somehow. Can I borrow the mouse for a second?
Where's that place?
Thank heaven for my techno people. Okay. So now the basic plan for invasion of Ticonderoga, at this point, the American army has captured, Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys have captured Ticonderoga. And so they're going to start at Ticonderoga, and they're going to work their way up Lake Champlain and take the forts at St. John's and Chambly and get to Montreal, take Montreal, and then eventually move up to take Quebec, the fortress of Quebec. General Washington approves a reinforcement force because he is not 100% sure that just this one force will be able to take the fortress of Quebec. It's a big stone fortress, so it's pretty large. It's going to need a lot of people. So he approves a reinforcement force led by Colonel Benedict Arnold 5 years before he becomes a traitor to travel up through Maine in support of Montgomery to help take the fortress of Quebec. Many books exist which detail the arduous, very arduous campaigns of both Montgomery and Arnold into Canada and up to the outskirts of the fortress of Quebec. Both of them are, I don't think anybody around here would want to even try and do it today. The maps, especially for Arnold going up through Maine, the maps are very poor. The amount of distance that he has to go is described as being much shorter than he actually ends up having to travel. He loses entire regiments of men on the trip going up. He eventually makes it with probably about 1/2 to 2/3 of the force that he started with, but it's one of the most arduous campaigns in the entire Revolutionary War. Like I said, a gazillion books exist. If you want to read about those campaigns, by all means, I'd rather not spend so much time on them right here. So please read up on that if you can. So Montgomery and Arnold, they get together in a council of war and they decide on a pincer plan to force the main gate, which is right here, of the fortress. The main gate is right there. They want to force it, but they want to have forces come in from the north, come in from the south. Arnold is going to take his force from the north here, and Montgomery is going to come up along the river to the south here. So in heavy snow, and we're talking probably 3 or 4 feet of snow and still snowing, at 4 a.m. on New Year's Eve, 1775, the southern force, led by Montgomery, unfortunately, is mowed down by cannon in a blockhouse right here. And at 37 years old, he is killed, along with about 13 other people in the very front row. Montgomery is leading, as he did in the entire campaign. He's leading from the front, and this blockhouse with like 4 cannon and probably 15 or 20 muskets all open fire at the same time and take out the entire front row of the force that's attacking it. At that point, Arnold's force up here gets into a battle for about an hour with British regulars, and he loses. He eventually makes his way back here, but probably half of his force is captured. The British win that one, and they pull everybody back into the fort over here. Down here, Montgomery, his entire front force is wiped out, and so everybody behind him says, "We're not going anywhere," and they retreat. And they go back, and they eventually join with Arnold on the north, on the upper city area, and they lay siege to Quebec. But that's all they can do. They can't attack it anymore. All they can do is lay siege. The British decide that they're not going to foray out into Arnold's men and lose men for no reason. So they have springs inside the fort. They're well provisioned. They can withstand a siege for many months, so they're going to stay put. Arnold stays put, and now we have a stalemate. But that's where that's where it goes in the short time after Montgomery is killed. So today, in Quebec today, there are plaques at the locations of Montgomery's death, the house where his body was placed in a coffin, where he was buried, and where 13 of the soldiers who were killed with him were buried. So you can go up and view them today if you ever get up into Quebec.
Have you ever been there?
No. Unfortunately, I wish I was, but I know I've not been up there. So the aftermath for Janet in the country. Janet loses her grandfather Beekman 2 weeks before Montgomery is killed, and her father a week after he's killed. The death of the 3 most important men in her life so close together is devastating, and she remains unmarried for the rest of her life, which goes on for another 52, 53 years. The Continental Congress discusses delaying the news of Montgomery's death for fear of severely impairing the morale of the country and its citizen soldiers. The news leaks out, though, and Congress renews its commitment to more men and supplies for the Canadian campaign. Arnold ends up with approximately 2,500 men sustaining the siege of Quebec. He's got all of these supplies he needs, 2,500 men that are helping him with it. But the beginning of May, the British decide to come down to St. Lawrence River with a force of 10,000 soldiers, 2,000 Hessians and 8,000 British regulars, and there's no way that Arnold's going to be able to fight any sort of winning battle against that. And so they pick up, the entire American force picks up and retreats all the way back down to Ticonderoga, and that's the end of the invasion of Canada. But the effort that Britain puts into repulsing the Canadian invasion pulls men in support for maintaining their hold on Boston. So I don't, if you remember your Revolutionary War history, soon after the April conflicts of Lexington and Concord, the American forces under General Washington surround Boston and lay siege to Boston, and now the British are trapped and holed up in Boston. And so that's what goes on all the rest of 1775 and into 1776. So Washington ends up surrounding Boston with Ticonderoga's guns. And and then the British evacuate on March 17th, leaving New England for good. They never come back again. And that's a whole other story, is General Knox's bringing of 59 pieces of heavy artillery down from Ticonderoga past Albany and then making a left turn and going all the way out to Boston in the dead of winter. Amazing story all by itself. The thing is that what Montgomery did, even though they lost up there, what it did was kept the British eye on I don't know why my unit's failing here, kept the British eye on Quebec and Montreal in that area, and they were also, of course, concerned garrisoning Boston, so on and so forth, and so they had no idea what was going on with General Knox and taking the cannon from Ticonderoga out to Boston. Complete surprise to them. And so both of those actions, certainly the ones up in Canada, were a help in distracting the British and allowing the guns to end up on Dorchester Heights, at which point they said, we can't sustain this anymore. And the entire British force, along with Tories, left and went up to Halifax, Nova Scotia. So Janet completes the house that Montgomery started, now today known as Grassmere, but it was not known at the time. And she lives there for over 25 years. In 1802, she buys 212 acres on the Hudson, closer to Claremont, her childhood home, where she builds and moves into a French chateau-style home she names Chateau de Montgomery, now called Montgomery Place, living there until her death in 1827. This is another home you can visit today, right up along the Hudson River. She sells her previous residence, the one that Richard started building, to her sister, and it burns to a shell in 1828. And I mention that specifically because it did not burn to the ground. It burned to the brick area down here. Well, they rebuilt on top of the brick area. They added 2 more floors, other wings and other changes, and it was then named Grassmere. It has numerous family owners, and a future Columbia University president was born there. It's permanently closed now. This is what it looks like. But the foundation down here, this area, this is what Richard built. And there's 3 gates on it. The gates are locked, chains that say no trespassing, so on and so forth. But the building is still there. The Continental Congress, very soon after they hear about Montgomery's death, and this was led by Benjamin Franklin, orders a monument to Montgomery from France in 1776. It's completed and sits in storage until it's finally able to be placed at St. Paul's Episcopal Church on Manhattan Island in 1787. Yes, you can go and see this today. This dedication right here on the monument was written by Benjamin Franklin. So when Montgomery is killed, he is buried just inside the gates of the Fortress of Quebec, immediately, within a couple of days. So in 1818, Janet gets the governor of New York to repatriate Montgomery's remains out of Canada to the U.S. He's buried with great fanfare and ceremony in front of his monument, July 8th of that year. And eventually, when Janet passes away, she is buried next to him. General Montgomery was revered around the country for 100 years after his death. 16 states have counties named for him, New York being one of them, Montgomery County. And at least 5 states have towns or cities named after him, the latest one being Montgomery, Alabama, 1871. Across the U.S., statues of Montgomery and roadside history markers continue to ensure that the general's legacy is not lost to history. The Fort Montgomery, which you are all here visiting today, is one of 2 forts in New York to be called such. The other one was built in the 1840s at the very top of Lake Champlain, has no notable history, and today is nothing but a derelict ruin. Our fort here was incomplete when it was overrun in October 1777, by British forces as they were heading north to reinforce General Burgoyne's invasion of New York from Canada, exactly what he was trying to prevent. Fortunately, the British invasion failed with the Patriot victory at Saratoga. To me, it's one of the saddest ironies of our early history that this fort that bears Montgomery's name was destroyed by troops attempting to support the very invasion by the British that Montgomery had worked so hard and sacrificed so much to prevent. General Richard Montgomery was our country's first military hero, not just because he gave his life for the revolutionary cause, but also because he lived and exemplified the qualities of leadership, duty, and patriotism that was, in the eyes of his contemporaries and even his enemies, second only to General George Washington himself. Such a life should be appreciated, revered, and certainly never forgotten. And I'm done. Any questions? Yes.
Any idea why Grassmere fell into ruin and dereliction?
It was populated mostly by Livingstons, and interesting thing. One of the last. It actually eventually turned into a sort of elite resort, and one of the last events that was held at that elite resort back in 2010 was Chelsea Clinton's pre-wedding dinner. It was still functioning as a place up till 2010. I read just recently online that back in October, a company called Soho House, which is based in Britain, has had plans on purchasing the property. They actually have more. They're an elite resort building sort of company, and they actually have more properties in the U.S. than they have in Britain. But they had plans on purchasing the property and turning it into another very exclusive, very elite resort. So we would love to see that happen. I was up there just a month ago. Nothing has happened so far. The place is still locked down. There's no construction equipment. Nothing is happening. So I don't know when this will happen. But it would be nice to see that place refurbished and brought back again. So that's the latest that I know about at this point. But that would be the fourth Richard Montgomery involved property that you would be able to visit in the Hudson Valley.
And then just one other question. Any idea how or why Montgomery's name became so popular throughout the country? Was Janet Livingston or Janet Montgomery like kind of pushing his legacy or behind that? Like, why is it there
Janet was old.
in Alabama, you know?
He was a military hero. The Revolutionary War figured in hugely in the first 100 years of this country, and he was its first hero. No question about it. Everyone knew Montgomery. Children were taught his name from the moment that they could read. He was very, very popular, very revered person back then.
So it was just on his reputation. It wasn't like there was some distinct effort by some group of people.
Not really, no. Janet Montgomery was always very, very protective of his legacy,
Yeah.
but she was not a national figure that would be promoting this sort of thing. She was known by all the presidents. They would visit her whenever they could, and so on. She was known by the very, very highest level of political people at the time. She was very well known in that circle, but the country at large knew very little about her, and she did not promote herself in that way. It was General Montgomery himself and his accomplishments. He had conquered more than 2/3 of Canada with his small force by himself. And like I said, once the Civil War happened in the U.S., and now all the names of the Civil War got to be known, Richard Montgomery got kind of pushed to the wayside. Okay, but up to that point, our greatest conflict was the Revolutionary War, and our greatest hero in our greatest conflict was Richard Montgomery, and so everyone knew him across the U.S.
Wow.
Yes?
You just wonder what he would have gone on to accomplish if he hadn't sadly been killed so young.
Well, somebody else
remarkable.
said today that if he had lived, it was very clear that after Washington, he would have easily become the second president of the United States.
Wow.
No question.
That would have been better than Adams. Did he have children?
No, he didn't.
Okay.
They were only together for about 2 years or so. She was 30 years old. He was 34. That was very late in those days, for a woman to have children at that age, it was very, in fact, dangerous.
Yeah.
And Richard was almost terrified of losing her in that way. And so they did not have children at that time.
So how could he have become president since he wasn't born in
that's
America?
right.
I thought that was their big thing. You had to be born on the continent.
I think that those were later amendments.
Yeah, I don't know. More research, yeah.
Or if he could become president, he would have easily been in the cabinets. He would have been Secretary of War, so on and so forth. He would have been very, very high politically throughout the rest of his life. There's no question. But he died at 37. Man, talk about packing a huge amount of life into 37 years. I find it fascinating. Yes.
Once again, I ask you to tell the people about Richard Montgomery coming down the Hudson.
Yes, after they disinterred him out of his grave in Quebec, they put him into a very, very fine coffin, and they brought him down in 1818. They would have brought him down by carriage to Lake Champlain, brought him down by boat, going across the portage, taking him down Lake George, and then got them onto the Hudson River, taking him down that way by boat, all the way down to Albany, where he, over July 4th in 1818, he was laid in state in the capital of Albany for a couple of days, where people could mourn him there. And then after that, they put him back on a boat, on a steamer, and sent him down the Hudson River. When Janet was informed that where the boat would be going by Fort Montgomery, because that's where she lived at the time, the boat came down and it actually stopped and parked right in front of Montgomery Place. And so she requested that she be allowed to be alone on the porch to mourn her general, as she called him. And so everybody left, and after a time, they looked out the window and saw the boat was moving off, and they went out to talk to Janet Montgomery, and she in fact had fainted with her grief. And then there was they made it down to New York City, and it was, I'll call it a mourning parade, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, a mourning parade that went from where he was taken from the boat, and they had already prepared his area in front of his monument at the church. They had already dug his grave there. And so it was a parade to take his coffin from there, and it was thousands and thousands of people that lined the route. And it was quite the occasion down in New York City. People commenting at the time said they'd never seen anything like it since General Washington's death. So he was a very, very popular man. And Janet was eventually laid beside him after she passed away. Did I cover everything for everybody?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.